Last month, I made a video taking a look at several footballers who seemed irreplaceable but actually weren't. Players like Fernandinho at Manchester City, for example, who I felt for a couple of years could prove to be the toughest player in Pep Guardiola's squad for him to replace, only for the citizens to have seemingly done so with ease in the form of Rodri. Don't get me wrong, it helps when you've got £63 million to throw at a problem, but you've still got to get it just right, even with all of that cash. Fernandinho did not feature in that 7, as I didn't want to give any spoilers here if there are any of you who might not yet have watched that video, but plan on doing so in the future. Anyhow, in light of several requests in the comments section of that video, I thought I would take a look at some footballers who seemed irreplaceable when they left a club and, well, really were irreplaceable.
We cannot replace him. We cannot.
There would be no knight in shining armour who came to the aid of these clubs when they lost their star men. These are players who were either sold, released, or just retired, and no replacement ever arrived. Players like Gareth Bale, who Tottenham spent more than £100 million trying to replace, but ended up with Nacer Chadli, Eric Lamela, Aaron Lennon, and Andros Townsend as their wide options. Or Alan Shearer, who was sold by Blackburn Rovers for a world record fee in 1996, just 12 months after the club had lifted the Premier League title. Blackburn finished 13th the following season and were relegated 3 years later. Or how about Xabi Alonso, who I thought was just about as important to Liverpool as Steven Gerrard in his final season at the club, and that was reflected in the fact that Rafa Benitez's side slipped from being Premier League runners-up on 86 points the season before he departed for Real Madrid, to finishing 7th on only 63 points the season after he left. You get the idea. Here are 7 footballers who genuinely were irreplaceable. 7th, Ngolo Kante. I felt quite conflicted about including Ngolo Kante in this 7, since I think Leicester City did just about as good a job as they could imaginably have done when it came to replacing him. Kante was absolutely colossal the year that Leicester became the most unexpected title winners in the entire history of English football's top flight. But just 6 months after he departed for Chelsea in a £32 million move, the Foxes signed Wilfred Ndidi from Genk in Belgium for £17 million. I am a huge fan of Ndidi's, and I think he is one of the best defence midfielders in the division, at least when he's fully fit. But he had only just turned 20 years old at that time. It is a mark of Ngolo Kante's extraordinary talent and impact upon a team that even though Leicester City did everything right, he still proved to be impossible to replace. Kante, Mahrez and Vardy were the 3 superstars in Leicester's unlikely title win if you like, but I think that Kante was the most important. His relentless running, tackling and ability to move Leicester quickly up the pitch was absolutely fundamental to Leicester's lethal counter-attacking football under Claudio Ranieri that season. And I think it is telling that whilst Kante didn't win the Premier League Player of the Year or even the Leicester City Player of the Season award that season, he did win the Leicester City Players Player of the Year award, voted for by his teammates. It would be disingenuous to suggest that Kante was the sole reason why Leicester went from finishing 14th the season before he arrived to winning the Premier League title in his only season at the King Power Stadium and then crashing back down to 12th place the following season. That was a freak season and Leicester were always likely to drop back down to earth at some stage. But it is worth noting that Chelsea also went from finishing 10th the year that Leicester won the league to winning the title during his debut campaign. And this time, Kante would win the Premier League Player of the Year award. Ultimately, Kante is a man who doesn't really have any equal in terms of the role that he performs on a football pitch in all of world football right now. And Leicester City are a club that know that better than anyone else. 6th, Neville Southall. Neville Southall is perhaps the greatest British goalkeeper of all time and among the finest from anywhere in the world. Yet, I rarely hear him being talked about in those terms. If Southall had played his best football for a modern mega club, and I say modern because Everton were genuinely one of, if not the best team in the world for a period of time that he was at the club, had he been English rather than Welsh, or just from any country that frequently made it to the finals of major international tournaments, and had he played his best football during the Premier League era rather than just before it, I think he would be recognised as actually having been probably the greatest goalkeeper English football has seen since at least Gordon Banks, and I include Peter Schmeichel in that. Southall had a real presence about him, which inspired confidence in him from his own defenders and struck fear into opponents. He was fantastic in one-on-one situations, he made very few glaring mistakes, and his slightly unusual character, at least among footballers, was crucial to Everton's dressing room dynamic. As Everton's all-time leading appearance holder and probably the greatest player in the entire history of the club, Southall was always likely to prove to be tricky to replace, if not downright impossible, and so it proved. Everton were already on the decline at the start of the Premier League era, and that continued during Southall's last few years at the club, as both Joe Royle and Howard Kendall tried and failed to replace him with Paul Gerrard. Everton have had a whole raft of goalkeepers since Southall departed the club in 1998, Tim Howard and Nigel Martin perhaps the best among them, and Espen Bardson and Sander Vesterveld the worst, but none have been remotely comparable to Southall himself, who is an absolutely lovely bloke who has been an advocate of many extremely worthy causes since hanging up his gloves. Oh, and there was also that Michael Owen video, wasn't there? Phenomenal goalkeeper, lovely bloke, mugged off Michael Owen. What's not to like? Fifth, Claude Makalele. I just want to state outright that Claude Makalele was a world-class footballer, and I am not saying that he is remotely overrated, because he was sensational. But all of the factors that perhaps conspired against Neville Southall and his legacy, and mean that he doesn't quite get the credit these days that he so richly deserves, went perfectly in Claude Makalele's favour. He played for a number of current super clubs, Real Madrid, Chelsea, PSG. He played for a very competitive national team in the form of France, and his football in England came during the Premier League era. The fact that, in England, Makalele also had the midfield anchor role named after him also seems to have led some people to believe that he is the greatest player to have ever played in that position, which I think would be a little bit of a stretch. Nonetheless, Makalele was outstanding at it, and it is a role that's importance is all too often overlooked. Florentino Perez is one man who has been scolded more than once for failing to appreciate its importance directly in relation to Claude Makalele, who he sold to Chelsea in 2003. Upon Makalele's departure, Perez stated, and I quote, "He wasn't a header of the ball, and he rarely passed the ball more than 3 meters. Younger players will arrive who will cause Makalele to be forgotten." End quote. Well, those younger players didn't arrive, and Perez's decision to sell Makalele certainly would not be forgotten. Zinedine Zidane supposedly once quipped, "Why put another layer of gold paint on the Bentley when you're losing the entire engine?" in response to Real Madrid selling Makalele during the same summer that they signed David Beckham. Makalele was superb for Chelsea, instrumental in turning the club into the best defensive unit of the Premier League era under Jose Mourinho. Meanwhile, Real Madrid slipped from having been title winners in the Frenchman's last season at the club to finishing in 4th place in La Liga. It took Real Madrid until at least 2009 and the signing of Xabi Alonso, and not really until Casemiro in the mid-2010s, to find someone who could replicate Makalele's impact and influence playing in the so-called Makalele role. 4th, Luis Suárez. For about 20 years before Liverpool appointed Jurgen Klopp, the Reds had a long track record of signing or developing brilliant players who propelled them back into title discussions, only for the club to sell them. There was Michael Owen and Xabi Alonso, who departed for Real Madrid, Javier Mascherano to Barcelona, Fernando Torres to Chelsea, and Raheem Sterling to Manchester City. Even after Klopp arrived, Liverpool was still powerless to prevent Philippe Coutinho from joining FC Barcelona, albeit That proved to be a much better piece of business for them than it did for Barca. And they were not yet the team then that they are now. The most glaring example of an individual thrusting Liverpool into title contention, only to then be sold, is of course Luis Suárez. The Uruguayan scored 31 goals in 33 Premier League games despite not taking penalties during his final season at Anfield, taking Liverpool within inches of winning what was then a very elusive Premier League title. In truth, whilst that Liverpool team did have a tremendous front three, their squad as a whole was certainly punching above their weight, with the likes of Simon Mignolet and John Flanagan being regular starters. However, with Suarez in that side, Liverpool always believed that they could win a game, through his sheer individual brilliance alone if nothing else, and very often they did just that. Whilst Suarez would always likely have proved impossible to replace, following his £65 million move to Barcelona, Liverpool did do a particularly terrible job of attempting to replace him. Mario Balotelli and Ricky Lambert hardly ever seem like tailor-made replacements for Suarez. Christian Benteke was almost as ineffective the following season, meanwhile Danny Ings did his ACL just 9 games into his Liverpool career. Almost 8 years on, the reality is that Liverpool still haven't actually replaced Suarez, they've just found a way to win games and score lots of goals without a world-class centre-forward leading their line. Third, Patrick Vieira. Patrick Vieira is a really interesting inclusion in this 7, or I thought so at least, because Arsenal only sold him because they felt they had the perfect replacement already lined up, and contrary to some people's retelling of the narrative, Arsenal did not fall apart the second that Vieira departed. Arsenal allowed Patrick Vieira to depart for Juventus in the summer of 2005, fresh off the back of a season in which they finished second in the Premier League. And whilst they did drop to 4th the following season, they also reached the final of the Champions League. What's more, the man who Arsene Wenger viewed as Vieira's replacement, Cesc Fabregas, scored the opening goal of the tie as Arsenal beat Vieira's new club Juventus 2-0 across 2 legs en route to the final of UEFA's Premier Knockout competition. Not only did Fabregas immediately inherit Vieira's number 4 shirt upon the Frenchman's departure, having just turned 18, within just a few years he would also inherit the Arsenal captaincy. Cesc Fabregas was absolutely talented enough to replace just about any footballer in midfield, and he did become an absolute gem of a player for Arsenal, playing more than 300 games for the club before signing for FC Barcelona. However, what Arsenal have never truly been able to replace since Vieira's departure, even with a plethora of very gifted midfielders, was Vieira's leadership, aggression, and sheer ability to drag Arsenal up the pitch. It is not as though Arsenal haven't tried to replace Vieira. The likes of Alex Song, Lucas Torreira, and most recently Thomas Partey were all brought in to at least bring some bite and leadership back into the Arsenal midfield, but not have been able to replicate Vieira's immense impact and presence on a football pitch. Perhaps the closest Arsenal have come to replacing Vieira was in the form of Abu Diaby, who could have been really special were it not for injuries, and was actually fairly similar to Vieira in style, but sadly, he was about as delicate as a water balloon, and, alas, Arsenal are still frequently found wanting in the centre of midfield. Second, Johan Cruyff. I was reluctant to include any of the most obvious all-time greats in this 7, since it seemed a little too easy on my part, and I didn't think that it would be particularly interesting on yours. Of course, Napoli would never be able to replace Diego Maradona, and as impressive as Santos' youth ranks are at producing players, there was never going to be another Pelé. So, I didn't consider any of those players, not even Ferenc Puskás at Budapest Honvéd, given the fact that plenty of other star players at Honvéd also departed at the same time as him following the 1956 Hungarian uprising. But I had to make a single exception for Johan Cruyff at Ajax. Johan Cruyff is not just the greatest player in the history of both Ajax and indeed the Netherlands, by some distance I might add, he was also integral to the style of football that both teams implemented during the 1960s and 70s. known as total football. Cruyff's impact on the implementation of total football was as profound as Rinus Michels. And unlike Michels, Cruyff was then able to step out onto the pitch and be the key exponent of total football, given his extraordinary football brain and sheer ability with a ball at his feet. Cruyff scored a total of 257 goals in 329 games during his first stint at Ajax, and Ajax won 3 successive European Cup crowns in Cruyff's last 3 seasons in Amsterdam, becoming the dominant force in European football. After Cruyff left to join Barcelona, Ajax fell from successive European Cup and Eredivisie titles to finishing 3rd in their own domestic top flight, scoring 33 goals fewer than they had done the previous season, and they went out in only the second round of the European Cup to CSKA Sofia. The closest Ajax came to replacing Cruyff came 3 years later, when they actually just re-signed the man himself. In 2 seasons back at Ajax, Cruyff won 2 Eredivisie titles and a League and Cup double in his second season. At the end of the 1982-83 season, in which Ajax won that double, thinking that Cruyff was finished, aged 36, Ajax decided against offering him a new deal. Rather insulted, Cruyff responded by joining Ajax's arch-rivals Feyenoord, where, in one last season, he won a League and Cup double yet again, winning the Dutch Footballer of the Year award. Meanwhile, Ajax dropped to 3rd without him in their side. The moral of the story, of course, is that you can never replace Johan Cruyff. First, Tom Finney. I know what you're thinking. It would have to take something pretty special to top a club that was built on the ideals and supreme talent of one man being totally unequipped to replace him not once, but twice. And indeed it does. Tom Finney is one of the finest players that English football has ever produced, and with the exception of a solitary appearance for both Toronto City and Distillery in Northern Ireland years after he retired, he spent his entire career playing for his boyhood club, Preston North End. Like so many great players of that era, Finney's career was interrupted by World War II, which delayed his professional debut until he was 24 years old. Despite Finney being one of the best players in the division and one of the first names on the England team sheet, working in tandem with Stanley Matthews on the opposite flank, Preston were relegated from the First Division in 1949. Still, Finney did not depart, or perhaps more accurately, was not allowed to depart, and 2 years later, Preston returned to the top flight. Over the next 7 seasons, Preston finished 3rd and 2nd twice in the First Division, only missing out on the title to Arsenal on goal average in 1953, and they reached an FA Cup final in 1954. During that time, Tom Finney twice won the FWA Footballer of the Year award, making him the first player to ever win the award more than once, and only 7 players have since replicated that feat, most recently Cristiano Ronaldo in 2008. In 1960, at the age of 38, Finney left Preston and retired from football. In his final season, he scored 21 goals in 43 games from the right flank, making him Preston's top scorer as the club finished 9th in the First Division. The following season, without Finney, Preston's top scorer scored only 12 goals and the club was relegated to the Second Division. It has now been 62 years since Tom Finney retired from football, and not only have Preston come nowhere near replacing him, which, in fairness, was always likely to be an impossible task, they haven't even managed to return to English football's top flight during that entire time. To say that Preston North End failed to replace Tom Finney would be rather a significant understatement. So, despite some excellent competition, he simply had to top this 7. That is it for today's video, but I would love to hear some of your suggestions down below in the comments. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you enjoyed today's video. If that was the case, then why not hit the like button? Feel free, as I say, to let me know your suggestions or just to leave your comments down below in the comments section, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on social media on either Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.